Welcome to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'm your host, Charles H.F. Diggs III, and we're thankful to be joined in conversation today by comrades and colleagues working to reimagine post-secondary institutions in a world without police. First, I would like to welcome Taylor Lewis and Jarell Roy, both of whom are graduate students in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education, as well as research associates here in the Campus Abolition Research Lab at the University of Michigan. Comrades, welcome. So I'm really excited for today's conversation, in part because I really want to get into this idea of campus safety, right? And really campus safety for whom? And both of your work speaks to this in various ways. And so, Jarell, I want to kind of start with you and Taylor bring you into a conversation about the myth of campus crime, right? And like what that actually looks like when we think about the data and all of the rationale that goes into why college and universities need police. So, Jarell, what can you tell us a bit about what you found in your research?
Absolutely. So it's interesting because institutional leaders often talk about the need for campus police to address campus crime, right? Everyone wants to feel safe on campus. Everyone wants to feel like they're able to walk around and be secure and not have to worry about crime. But the reality is the research shows that campus crime has actually gone down and has steadily gone down over the years and decades. And the majority of really what campus police are doing are for non-violent issues. Things like property crime, things like alcohol and drugs, traffic stops, things that don't necessarily require armed police officer to address. So that's what I'll start with that.
And so, Taylor, part of this also alludes to sort of policing beyond departments and like individual officers. And I know, your specific work with queer, trans, and non-binary students of color, but specifically Black students, also speaks to the ways that policing functions sort of outside of that specific carceral apparatus. And so can you help us understand what your work is kind of teaching about our understandings of what is and is not policing?
Yeah, I think going off what Jarell said, police only comes in after those violent crimes. They don't stop that, prevent that. And I think a lot of the work of what we were trying to imagine is how do we prevent those violent things from occurring? How do we reduce harm from actually recurring and happening? I think that's a work of us rather than the police, and it's also the work of addressing some of the oppressive forces and dominant forces that shapes our society, our institutions. So particularly in my work and thinking about queer and trans students of color, I'm thinking about also the ways that they're made unsafe through dominant forces like transphobia, queerphobia, and the intersections of race and those transphobia and queerphobia as well. So I'm thinking about the ways that they're often policed and surveilled informally in the classroom, in residence halls, where they are where policing happens to reinforce domination and normativity as well. And so they often fall outside of those things because there are not white normativity, white supremacist normativity, which is like white cis-heterotic patriarchy. They fall outside of those norms, and so there's ways that they're policed because they don't fall inside those dominant norms by the way they might dress, the way they might engage with their whoever their romantic or sexual partners are as well. And these are the ways that they're often made unsafe in these places on campus too. And so my work kind of really addresses thinking about eradicating oppression, looking towards oppressions, the ways that it makes people unhealthy and the ways that people unsafe as well.
So part of what I'm hearing, right, is like this idea of like our presence fundamentally being political, right, and like white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, cisnormative system. And when I think about that, I can only sort of reflect on even our own individual experiences of existing in these institutions and the ways that we've been policed. And Jarell, I know you have like sort of a specific set of experiences that drew you to this work. I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about that experience for yourself.
Absolutely. My first day on campus as an undergrad at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I remember I was walking to a friend's dorm, and I had a Wisconsin t-shirt on. Back then I had a nice little fresh fro, a little different now, but and I was feeling good. It was my first day on campus. I was a college kid. I was feeling really good, and I was walking across the street with a Sprite bottle in my hand, and a campus police officer stopped me. And, he harassed me. He was asking me about what I was doing, where I was going. He asked me what was in the Sprite bottle. He asked to see my ID. I tried to explain to him that it was my first day on campus, like really first hour on campus, so I hadn't had a chance to get my ID yet. And he asked for alternate forms of ID, and it was very dehumanizing. It was very embarrassing because there was a lot of people walking around just looking at me, and no one intervened. And he eventually let me go. It felt like forever. I'm not exactly sure how long it was, but that was my first encounter. And I remember the week afterwards, I went to talk to my advisor, my academic advisor, about this situation, and she told me that campus police are here to make sure that people are feeling safe. And I remember thinking, well, I didn't feel very safe then. And that was the first and last time I had a conversation with that person. So, yeah, I think this has definitely, that was unfortunately not the last time that I had some sort of encounter with campus police, and it just kind of shows that it's beyond just that, like, obviously that individual made a decision, but also that individual was operating under an institution where, he was following what he was supposed to be doing according to what these set of practices deemed him to, be able to do. So it's beyond just him as an individual and these individual officers, and it's more these systems that are keeping this in place.
It's so interesting, right? Because often whenever these things happen and result in particular types of brutality or violence, the retort is they followed procedure, right? And we don't often raise questions of that procedure. And I'm thinking and reflecting even on my own undergraduate experience, and the first time I had sort of engagement with not just even campus police, but police in the city of Tallahassee. And I remember I was driving back from a friend's house, they were having a get together or whatever, and I had I think one beer, wasn't 21 yet, and I'm driving. And my cute little sports car or whatever in this town, and I have another student who's white who's with me, who's also a woman, that were wanting to leave, and I was like, cool, I'll just drop you off. I gotta go, do something anyway. And I remember getting pulled over, but the car that pulled me over, I think, was the city of police, municipal police first, but then behind that car came someone from the county, a sheriff was there. Then campus police came up, and I'm trying to understand why do we need 3 police cars in this situation where nothing had necessarily happened. And big college party school sort of environment, right? It's we just hedge our bets that someone's been drunk and driving. And so we go through the whole sort of rigmarole. I do all of the sobriety tests, and they're they essentially say, you're not a danger to yourself or anybody else. You passed all of the tests, but I was under 21, so they had to do something well, we can't let you drive home, essentially. And I remember raising the question, well, why do you need all these police? Oh, well, it's just protocol that we never stop somebody, and just have one officer sort of on the site. But then I'm juxtaposing this to all the other sort of social gatherings that happen at a big football school, right? And the way that police, even if they came into say a white fraternity house during a function, at most they just told people to go home. Right, and then by contrast, even for us, as a Black Creek-led organization, police would literally just stand outside of our functions the entire time, right, just waiting for something to happen or looking for some sort of disturbance in order to be able to arrest people. And so there was something deeply troubling, but also very predictable, right, about sort of racialized policing, and especially in the South. But that was something that always stuck with me, and I think part of the only reason I was even able to survive those interactions is both of you, I'm sure, I had some version of the talk, right, about what to do if you're ever stopped by a police officer. So as soon as those sirens go on, windows go down, pull them over immediately, hands are where you can see them, you're speaking in a respectable tone. And I don't know that we often have enough conversation of that level of translation, right, of that being a skill set almost that you're given and take with you to some of these predominantly white institutional environments in order to as you mentioned, get home safely, even though the people that are supposed to guarantee that are actually the folks that make you feel less safe. Taylor, any thoughts here?
I think that's additional kind of argument of why, to remove police off campus. I think that oftentimes campus police officers get dubbed the nice cops, and all the bad cops, the killer cops are outside. Municipal police or state police, and we're just kind of the nice cops. And in my former institution, the campus police were under in student affairs, so it's kind of we're a part of the fabric of this institution. We're part of student affairs and the student experiences, so they can formally kind of we're the nice cops essentially. And so I think for me, that was hard for me, speaking from also a personal antidote, as well, being on that campus. It's the first time I was on a large public university, and one of the days that we had is this day where like pretty much students drink. St. Patrick's Day is usually during spring break, and so they have like their own like kind of drinking holiday. And so the campus does some kind of engagement to steer students away from drinking. So they have like a formal big concert during that day. And also during that day, the campus is like severely like policed, and like state police. Campus police, which are like way bigger than even the town police, also there as well. And so yeah, there. I came outside of my res hall. I was a assistant resident director at the time. Came outside my res hall, and there's like K9 units and cop cars filling the entire parking lot. And instantly, like I get like uncomfortable. No cop has approached me at that point, but just seeing that very presence of K9 units and seeing some other cops with like heavily geared like SWAT kind of like gear on, like made me feel instantly unsafe, and I felt it within my body of like tensing up. Of my heart beating really, really fast, and instantly just like, let me get in my car and get off of this campus right now. And so the ways that the kind of cycle, kind of logical distress that a lot of us Black folks face whenever we see the police, not even having to engage with them, but know from past experiences of our siblings, of our community, knowing that these people are unsafe, and instantly like we feel it in our body to know that they are not okay. And so really thinking about the psychological distress, that connection of health and safety as well, to really talk about the ways that why police are not campus safety, because they're not safety for me, they're not safety for my other Black siblings, and folks and community as well, and really talking about the ways historically that the institution deems who was safe and who was to made unsafe on campus.
You brought up an interesting point about sort of this notion of like psychological safety, right? Or in some ways dignitary safety, which we take up in some other aspects of the research. But I want to talk about specifically the sort of like almost endemic mental health crisis that we see on college universities' campuses, and particularly how we spend an exorbitant amount of resources, right, both in society but also in college university campuses, that go towards departments of public safety, police specifically. And Jarell, I'm wondering if you can sort of walk us through sort of how you've come to understand this disparity and sort of what the implications are for Black students, I think sort of broadly, but also even those that are even made more vulnerable, right, to live at those intersections of race, gender, class, sexuality.
Absolutely. Yeah, in my research, in talking with current students, Black students and other students of color, it's been very clear that students are just not receiving what they need, right? So, for example, a handful of students talked about how, on campus there's, counseling and psychological services. So if someone needs, a therapist and what have you, there's that service here on campus, but it's very underfunded. Students have long wait lists to be able to see someone, and even when they do get to see one, this is, I've had to deal with this myself. They try to limit the amount of times you can see this therapist, right? And as we know, it takes more than 3, 4, 5 sessions to get the support that you need. But then you think about, so for example, one student shared how they were having a crisis and they did what they were supposed to do, which was call the counseling services, and they called the counseling services, and 10 minutes later, 4 police officers showed up at their dorm. And you can imagine how this student was feeling, right? Was already dealing with some mental health issues, and was having a crisis and needed support. And all of a sudden some armed police show up, both campus police along with the city police. And it was, as you can imagine, a very traumatic situation for the students. They did not feel safe. Not only did they not feel safe, they felt harmed in that space, and was also trying to deal with the crisis that they were originally having to deal with. So what we see is that the budget isn't the budget that's going towards the money that's being allocated towards this campus police and just policing in general at schools is not used in the right way, and it's not what students need, and particularly Black and brown students who are made to be vulnerable by these institutions.
So what's interesting about, there's so many different interesting things about that data point, but specifically this continuation of what we see sort of in broader society, right? That like we're tasking police with doing things that we actually have other trained, like skilled professionals who can de-escalate situations, right? Have sort of the skill set to respond in the ways that people are looking for some socio-emotional support, and what we often see in a variety of instances, right? Like in community, similar situation, people call 911 trying to get help, they send police escalate, something goes into a totally different direction. And that would seem especially nefarious at a college or university, right? That in many ways, as our parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles entrust us to these institutions, the last thing that they probably want to have happen is like, you send police to my baby's door. And yet this is like the most common response. Taylor, I'm wondering if you can speak to issues of even like representation, right, within a place like counseling and psychological services, or also just general services for QT-POC students on campus that also seem to be underserved and under-resourced, while we're also spending tons of money, millions of dollars even, right, on the policing apparatus on campus.
Yeah, and so we're definitely in a mass disabling event right now, physically, but also psychological, emotional, mentally as well. And so definitely those wait times for counselors are increasing, especially counselors who are going to be affirming for QT-POC specifically. So those who are gender affirming, those who are queer affirming, and those who are also racially affirming as well. And so we already know just by the ways, the obstacles to get a degree and to get through academia, that these licensed counselors are few that are going to represent the identities of QT-POC folks. And so when these are the people you want to seek out, and it's already very few representation itself, the wait times just increasingly get long and hard to see somebody who's going to be able to affirm your experience, because they share your experience, they share your identities as well. So I don't know if the higher education specifically is really understanding, as we try to move back to this sense of like normativity during these times, that is a whole huge mass disabling event. I don't know if higher education has the capacity right now to be able to assist and support people as well. But we definitely have the money to fund millions of dollars for our police departments, and those budgets are increasingly every year. And it's really just interesting that when assessing, diversity, equity, inclusion, that we're not looking at the ways that this connects to campus safety, which speaks to my work of like we put safety and distinct to other things like health and wellness, to diversity, equity, inclusion, where all these things need to really come together. And if we really care about that, we will look at campus safety and look at the way that campus and police can be a vehicle for harm, for oppression as well, and look at ways that we can further reduce those harms, which might mean taking a little bit of money into funding them and giving it to counseling services, or also look at ways that we can, as higher education, as academia, can make sure that we are bringing in and allowing people from the communities that we are trying to serve in and making that process less accessible for them as well. So looking at school social work, like how are we making that accessible for people in the community to come in, so that we can have the people who represent this community qualified to assist these folks for like mental, psychosocial, and emotional issues.
Yeah, I think especially for like public institutions, right? Those that claim to be for the public good, but often are serving privatized interests, but also have like a huge impact on communities that are in proximity to the college and university, right? And one thing we know to be true, the campus police are able to and do patrol and make arrests off campus. We've seen a number of instances, whether that's in Minneapolis or in the post-George Floyd moment, but also what happened in Brooklyn Center, police being deployed, right, from the university to the city. We saw this also in Philadelphia, sort of in the racial reckoning that was taking place there of University of Pennsylvania and Drexel police being deployed there. We also have some instances even in our local jurisdiction, right, as you mentioned, of municipal and campus police working together to, address communities that they're espousing that they serve, but are only serving really, for this particular form of carceral punishment, carceral justice. But I think what's also interesting too is that, Taylor, when you were speaking earlier, you talked about the experience you had as an undergraduate student, like coming out of your dorm to see sort of like heavily armed police. And I think about, too, sort of this intersection of like militarism, right, that also is shaping the way we think about policing in this country, but also like even access, right? So, I think you both are aware of like the 1033 program, which is the Department of Defense program that essentially allows for like surplus military grade weapons to be undertaken by municipal police departments primarily. But like also 100 universities have been a part of this program, right? Like Ohio State University has a SWAT tank basically for their policing, which one could imagine like, what would you even need that for in a college university context, right? And it's certainly not for, Ohio State losing a game and there being, some sort of pandemonium that happens thereafter. But all these things are interesting of like, we often think about DEI in relation to finance. And like our budget is sort of an indication of like where our investments are and how much we're really committed to that. So what does it say about an institution that's spending, year over year, like you said, more and more money in things that seem very antithetical to the very things we're espousing politically, and that sort of discontinuity. But I want to sort of think about our conversation and returning to this question of like safety for whom, right? And the extent to which in your work, safety, as you already mentioned, is not necessarily represented by the presence of police, but also the consequences of police presence on ideas of safety, while also not having the resources even to respond to that sort of experience of trauma, and like how you make sense of this sort of dual threat, if I can say, to the overall emotional, psychological, and even material well-being of Black and queer and trans students of color.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to consider that, as we said, this is a institutional systemic issue where campus police have time and time again created very unsafe situations for students. I mean, we just saw a couple months ago at Winston State University where a Black woman was arrested in her classroom for having a verbal argument with her professor. And it was, again, the school's priority or the school's policy to call the campus police when there's some sort of situation like this. So again, this is a professor and the folks involved in that situation were following protocol, and that protocol led to harm for this student. And that's not the first time that's happened. It's happening all over the country, and we really need to ask, like, who is being served by these campus police and who is being harmed? And research is like our research, both of our research, all of our research is very clear on this, that students of color and queer students and Black students in particular are disproportionately harmed by campus police, and we need to do something else.
So Taylor, given your residence life specific experience, and this is, I think, a very important sort of aspect, right, as like higher ed student affairs folks, I don't think folks really understand like that interplay between student affairs and resident life in particular with policing. And I'm wondering if you can sort of speak to, from your experience, of sort of the ways that you all are like trained and even socialized around how police can or should be involved in issues in residence life.
Yeah, it's a direct partnership with campus police that Residence Life has. One of that is being if there are any calls about mental health issues or concerns, is usually police are going to come and show up in addition to the counselors. Oftentimes the counselors are the folks on the phone, but the police are people that actually physically show up there as well. And that's just like a part of the protocol that we're taught, is that you got to call to the campus police, and you got to also call the counselor who's on duty that night as well. I think also the ways that the carceral criminal justice system is built into the way we talk about conduct is also really important. As assistant resident director, I had to do conduct, and we used language like probation, and we used language like that was very like reminiscent of the criminal justice system. And so I felt always uneasy like doing this process with Black folks. I had to like figure out some ways to like lessen the importance and impact of what was happening. But essentially we talk about this in a very learning manner, in that we're going to talk to people about the consequences of the actions, and they're going to teach them why they shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. But yet we're using language that's punishment, like we're reminiscing of a dominant punishment regime as well. And so and those kind of manners, I had to like figure out sometimes not to report certain things, or certain times to lessen what would typically be the punishment. And that shifted when I was especially working with black folks and black students who are often coming in like, why am I getting this letter? Like, what is this going to do with my scholarship? What is this going to do with my place here? Because they're already made vulnerable, already told that you got to jump through hoops to be here, and that you're not meant to be here because of you don't deserve it, because we see you as a criminal anyways, and so a place of higher education is not for you. So definitely had to approach those conversations and approach the way I talk to these folks in a very different manner, because the overseeing system that I was a part of, maybe it was directly connected to the carceral like system, as far as working directly with police partnerships, or using some of that same language and same ways that we handle folks who make mistakes or break rules or policies and things like that.
Yeah, that has me thinking a lot about Carla Shedd's scholarship on what she describes as the carceral continuum. And although talking about it in sort of the context of K-12 schools, and we are all familiar with sort of the language of the school to prison pipeline, right, which is sort of a misleading sort of framework, and we understand the limitations of that, right, because there are multiple entry points like departures, rearrivals, but very few folks are considering like that in the sort of post-secondary context, right, where that's like justice-involved youth who are like able to gain access and matriculate to a college, university, and what their experiences might be, right, if there's some level of police involvement. But even this idea of like criminalizing a student who has otherwise had no prior involvement with the criminal legal system, that now has some sort of police record as a result of like the protocols, as you mentioned. And so even now thinking too about sort of the college to prison pipeline that might even exist, and maybe jails more readily available than say possibly like prison, depending on the situation. But that's not typically a part of that conversation, right? Of these like what I would sort of frame as carceral entanglements. And when you spoke about sort of a student coming in, not necessarily even just being concerned about the housing situation, right? It was like, what's going to happen to my scholarship if, and that even being a condition, right? Almost like you already are on probation, right? Yeah. Or you have like a violation of a thing that you didn't know you're on, and this always already way that like black students and black bodies on a predominantly white campus especially are almost in a consistent state of probationary periods, right? Until you actually graduate, if you're lucky enough to graduate and have the resources and supports. And I think we need to have like way more conversation about that, as you all are alluding. Yeah, this was like a great kind of like thought experiment, right? Just think about all the ways that this is happening that we're not having conversation about. So we talked quite a bit about sort of different aspects of this, and sort of again raising this question of like safety for whom. But I think that also begs the question of what safety might look like. And as a part of all of our conversations, and before we end each episode, we want to like invite our guests into this exercise of imagination and thinking about, what a police-free future might sort of involve, right? How might that show up? And so when we think about this as abolitionists, of course we understand, because Ruthie Gilmore teaches us, right, it's not just about absence, but it is about the presence of a life-affirming institution. And so if we're thinking about higher education in a way that might be more life-affirming, and Taylor, you were kind of alluding to this a bit, and so I'll start with you. When you think about that for, queer, trans, and non-binary students of color, what might that look like, right? Like, what is the presence of a life-affirming space for them in a post-secondary context perhaps look like based on the work that you've done?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks who are focused on race, specifically like anti-blackness, talked about how these oppressive forces lead to premature death, and I think those things would definitely go alongside the way we talk about domination through like a queer and trans kind of oppression and kind of lens as well. And so I think that's really what my work is advocating for, is ways that we can eliminate those oppressive forces as well. I think as somebody who is pretty pessimistic about institutions and if they're really change, I think my work is going to always be calling out the harm, and to make them understand and feel the harm, the horror of the way that their systems really hurt people and leads to premature death, and using language like that, like this is violent. When people are experiencing microaggressions every day, that is an example of violence in ways that they're made unsafe on campus. But really my work also is really speaking to the queer and trans communities on campus, and inviting them to reimagine on campus, inviting their cishet siblings as well to like come and reimagine with your queer and trans siblings, as well to reimagine safety. And so that includes the ways that eliminating intra-community harm as well. And so making sure that we're talking about safety and freedom and liberation, that you're including your trans and your queer folks as well, and you include them in your plans, including them in your thoughts about safety and about liberation as well. And so my work is really calling a call to them to really imagine and to resist, and that you don't need to follow some of the same kind of logics that this institution teaches you, that society teaches you, and figure out ways that we can be our own source of safety, and that we can keep each other safe as well. And so really thinking about those like resistive practices there, but also thinking about ways that we can bring abolitionists really inter kind of like relational aspect as well. So not just thinking about institutions and formal policing systems, but thinking about the ways that we are the police as well, and thinking about ways that we can eliminate and disinvest from like cultural logics as well in our everyday lives, to be more loving, to be more life affirming.
Thank you. Jarell, things that you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that, absolutely. And really, I just love this question broadly because I'm often reminded of, abolitionists during slavery, right? They were able to imagine something that had not existed before, right? And there was a lot of pushback of like, oh, how will anything happen without slavery, right? And that's sort of like the time that we're in now, right? People were like, well, how will campuses be safe? What do we do about crime? How do we keep people safe? And it requires this radical imagination to think beyond the logics that we all have internalized. From my research, folks talk about a handful of things. I think one is just eventual, abolition. So, police are no longer, broadly in society, but especially at schools and colleges, right? So no more. Also recognizing that it's an incremental process that might start with reallocating resources. So there's an abundance of resources that are needed, that students need, thinking about psychological and, counseling services. So there are no longer long wait lists, and people can get the amount of, therapy sessions that they need, and they're not limited. So abundance of resources. And then I think another big aspect is to imagine how we can shift away from this idea of punishment to repair. I think all of us have talked about how, campus police are operating in this form of, who did what and how do we punish them for it. And a lot of my interviews, students talked about how they were afraid to call anyone for situations when they needed help because there weren't any alternatives to call besides someone who might show up with, a deadly weapon. And so I think about colleges and universities where, underage drinking might be a big thing for a variety of reasons, and students might need support at a certain point, but don't want to make things worse by having campus police show up. So how can we reallocate those resources that are going to campus police and have them go to other services that will actually repair any harm that has maybe been done, and get folks the support that they need as opposed to causing more harm. So I think that's the other big one for me. And, eventually, decriminalizing acts that folks choose for survival. I think that's a big one. And really just like listening to scholars who have been talking about this for centuries and following recommendations that have already been put forth. Task force are great, but they are not a solution in and of themselves. So, yeah.
Well, Taylor, Jarell, thank you both so much for sitting down and sharing your genius with us. I think this is very instructive and useful, certainly for the field, but even for me. I learn from you both on a regular basis. So I'm just, a pleasure to be in the same space as you, to be able to share and do this work together, and hopefully we'll have more conversations in the very near future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'd also like to thank the National Center for Institutional Diversity and the Anti-Racism Collaborative's Research Community Impact Fellowship, whose generous support made today's production possible. For more information about the Police Free Campus project, Or to find resources about reimagining a world without police, visit our project website at policefreecampus.org. If you're interested to learn more about the work at the Campus Abolition Research Lab, consider joining our mailing list by visiting our website at campusabolition.org or following us on Twitter at campusabolition. We really, really, really appreciate y'all rocking with us, and we hope to continue to produce content that helps make new worlds possible. So be sure to tell your friends about us, and don't forget to share, like, and comment wherever you're listening to our podcast. Until next time, study, struggle, and peace.